all of you who are listening or watching this already know how to read. This is an activity on reading better. This is an activity on reading in different ways. How to read a book. This is a book by Mortimer Adler and Charles Van Doren. This is a great book. I recommend it to everybody. They talk about different levels of reading, and I find this very helpful. The first level is elementary reading. This is where you learn the letters, you learn the basic sounds, you learn syllables, you learn sentences, paragraphs, things like this. This is what you learn in elementary school. This is not really what we're going to be doing in this activity. As we read 1 Corinthians 1 through 4, I'm going to assume you all know how to do elementary reading, and we're not really going to discuss that. There's another type of reading that they discuss called inspectional reading. This is something that's great for any work of any length, of something that's not really short. Like what we're doing is just 4 chapters in 1 Corinthians, so it's a very short work. So, and it's actually only a piece of a short work. So we're not going to do inspectional reading. But what inspectional reading is taking a timed or a short period of time to read through a book, look at the chapters, look at the table of contents, maybe dip into each chapter to get a basic idea of what the book is about. That's inspectional reading. It's not a deep reading. It's using elementary reading, but you're not reading the whole book at this point. Another level of reading, and this is what we're going to be working on, is analytical reading. And so the first time you read 1 Corinthians, what you might do is you might just read straight through it. That is not an analytical reading. That is an elementary reading. You're just reading through it. What analytical reading does is it, as you can tell from the name, it's an analysis of the book as you read. It is reading about it, reflecting, making sure you understand what the author is trying to talk about and what he's trying to do as you read. This can be very time-consuming depending on the work. 1 Corinthians, it actually is time-consuming to do this and will take multiple analytical readings, and it deserves multiple analytical readings to understand. This is going through the book paragraph by paragraph, sometimes sentence by sentence, and trying to figure out what's going on. You could do an analytical reading of, for example, a history book or a philosophical book. This doesn't have to be something related to just scripture. Anytime you want to take a book and you want to really digest it, anytime you want to read through a book and thoroughly understand it, or understand it as best as you can. This is analytical reading, and this is the activity we're going to be practicing because it takes more work, it takes more mental effort to do than elementary reading, though it does require it. And finally, there's this other level, syntopical or synoptical reading. This is where you take perhaps multiple books that you read analytically and you combine them. For example, you could read 1 Corinthians analytically, and then you read Romans analytically, and then you try to combine them. You take these and you try to say, okay, what is Paul saying that's similar between these? And trying to come up with the overlap between the two, trying to build a theology of Paul. And then doing an analytical reading of the book of Hebrews and saying, okay, how do I meld 1 Corinthians, Romans, and the book of Hebrews? This is a synoptical reading where you're taking multiple things together and trying to see their overlap, or in some cases trying to see their differences and whatnot. Other types of activities that are synoptical reading are, for example, systematic theology. Systematic theology is where you take the text of Scripture, then you maybe take a modern author and you take an ancient author or multiple modern authors or multiple ancient authors, and you try to read them all together. Systematic theology is an excellent exercise in synoptical reading as you put multiple things together. You could do this really with anything. If you take 2 political arguments on 2 different sides and you read both of them analytically and you try to combine them, that is synoptical reading. This is something we have to do in all sorts of areas of life. Theology, philosophy, history, politics, science, all sorts of areas where we have to do reading that requires us to combine multiple different sources. For any thinking adult, this is absolutely something that is required. Now, Adler and Van Doren in their section on analytical reading, they have the first stage of analytical reading. First stage is to classify the book according to kind and subject matter, meaning to do an effective analytical read, you have to know what kind of book you're reading. A history book is different than an argument. A science book is going to read different than a history book. A political book is going to read differently than a science book. And so first you have to classify what you're reading about, because that will help you understand what to look for. I've already classified 1 Corinthians 1 through 4. It is an argument. Paul is making an argument to a group of people to try to get them to behave in a certain way. It is an argument, and so we're practicing reading an argument. Second stage for Adler and Van Doren is to state what the whole book is about with the utmost brevity. One of your goals whenever you're doing this kind of reading is to be able to summarize, what is this book about? Can I state what is the unity of this book? What is the thing that unifies it? What's the goal? What's the whole book about? But really, to do that, you have to be able to enumerate its major parts in their order and relation, and outline these parts as you have outlined the whole. And so if you want to understand the whole of a book, you really need to understand the parts of the book. If you don't understand the parts, there's a decent chance you don't understand the whole. So you have to work through and see how these parts work together. And this is the primary activity we're going to be doing in 1 Corinthians 1 through 4, is going through its parts. Though the goal is ultimately to understand what's the whole, what's it trying to get at. And also, once we go through all these parts, we'll be able to define the problem or problems the author is trying to solve. And so these are fairly obvious in 1 Corinthians. In 1 Corinthians 1 through 4, he states his problem very clearly in the first part of the argument. And you'll see that once you read through it. But this is our focus right here, enumerating major parts. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take each paragraph and we are going to summarize each paragraph one at a time. You read a paragraph, you stop, you think, you reflect, and then you write down as succinctly as possible what the point of that paragraph is. Next, what we'll do is once you get through 1 through 4, is you'll do it all again. And now you're going to work through the text and try to figure out what links each paragraph to each paragraph that comes after it. Because it is an argument. This is not a series of random thoughts by Paul. This is an argument. It might actually seem that way. Once you read the paragraph where Paul states the problem, he then seems to change subject. He doesn't actually change subject. He seems to. He is continuing his argument, and then he brings it back a few paragraphs later. And so reading through and seeing what each paragraph is about, and then thinking through what links them is important. It is necessary whenever you read an argument, because this helps you find out what they're trying to do. And then you really repeat this process as necessary. These things don't have to be done as two different steps. You can take a paragraph, then take another paragraph and think about how they link. And then take another paragraph and think about how they link. But this is something that often needs to be done multiple times for a single text, especially a difficult text. Read each paragraph, think through as much time as you need to take to understand that text. So that's what we're doing. Read a paragraph, summarize it. Go through the whole text of 1 Corinthians 1 through 4, and then start over again. And this time, focus on seeing how they link. Seeing how each paragraph relates to the others. This is a quote pulled from the Adler and Van Doren book. It's a great quote. Some books are to be tasted, others to be swallowed, and some few to be chewed and digested. You could think of an inspectional reading as just a tasting of a book. You take a book, look through it, skim it in 15 minutes and go, that's interesting, but no thank you. I don't want to read that. Or, that's interesting, and I think I will read more. If you just read through a book from front to back without really perhaps breaking it down and thinking through each part, that's like a elementary reading of a whole book. That's swallowing a book. But some things are meant to be chewed and digested. You not just consume it, but you ponder. You spend time on it. There are lots of books that are really worth reading at that level. Many books that aren't. 1 Corinthians 1 through 4 is a good example of one that should be chewed and digested. That is something we should spend our time on and think through. So that's what we're going to be doing in this activity.